You're listening to the Full and Thriving Podcast, a place where courageous women come to break free from food obsession, heal their relationship with their body, and strive to live a life that's present, lighthearted, and meaningful. If you're listening, my wish is that this podcast serves as a catalyst that inspires you to nourish your body, nurture your mind, and energize your spirit. I'm your host, Meg McCabe, a certified life coach and eating disorder recovery coach with a PhD in having a good time. Just kidding about that last part. Anyway, thank you so much for listening and enjoy the show. Hey everybody, I hope you're having a beautiful day. I know we're getting closer to the holidays, and that is just so exciting for me. I wanted to have a solo show with all of you today, talking about a topic that I know is on so many of your minds, especially during the holidays, and that is whether or not you should ditch the scale. And I think for some of you who may not think full recovery is possible, or maybe recovery support is not as accessible, it may not be possible for you to ditch the scale at this point. But for those of you who are really seeking full recovery, I highly suggest that you ditch the scale as soon as possible, because ditching the scale actually increases your chances of full recovery. So with that, today we are going to dive in to 5 reasons why you should ditch the scale immediately. So, are you constantly obsessing over the number on the scale? Does the number impact your mood? Does it determine when and how much you're allowed to eat? Do you have an emotional reaction to the number on the scale? Do you feel like stepping on the scale gives you a sense of control? When asked to get rid of the scale, are you nervous? Are you anxious about that? Well, if any of these questions apply to you, and if you relate to anything I just brought up, I really think this episode is for you. So without further ado, I am going to dive into 5 reasons why you should just ditch the scale right away. And I know that if you're listening to Full and Thriving in general, this is a topic that you're probably thinking about. And my hope is that after listening to this show, you can decide to stop weighing yourself once and for all. As a fully recovered person, I used to be very dependent on the number on the scale, and I would weigh myself daily, and that number reflected how I felt about myself. It told me how to think, how to feel, what I could and couldn't eat, and that was really hard. And personally, I don't think I would have been able to fully recover if I continued stepping on the scale. So remember this, when you let go of the number on the scale, your chances of recovery really do increase. So the number one reason why I want you to ditch the scale, the first one, and this one was like the most significant reason for me, is because stepping on the scale is an emotional roller coaster. Honestly, I remember stepping on the scale, and it was what determined how good my day was going to be or not. So if I stepped on the scale and the number was lower, I would feel awesome. And then if I stepped on the scale and the number was higher, I would get really upset. It would trigger more painful emotion, and it would decrease my sense of self-worth and self-esteem. And literally most of the time, the day would just be totally wash from that point. Like there was no coming back from seeing a number on the scale I didn't want to see. So why I can't stand the scale, honestly, is because it completely disconnects us from our inner truth and, more importantly, our inner peace. Stepping on the scale can be a peace disruptor. Have you ever woke up one day feeling happy and good in your body, or good-ish, and then step on the scale and the number isn't what you, quote, hope to see, and then it destroys your day? Well, all of a sudden, that day that started out so amazing flips over, right? You lose the wind out of your sails just because of this number, and your mood drops. And then the internal eating disorder voice gets louder and meaner and more critical. And I find that the number on the scale has way too much power over our emotions because of all of the thoughts and judgments that stem from that number. And it sets us up to feel so unstable day to day. And this roller coaster is essentially based on something that is extremely fleeting to begin with. That number on the scale varies day to day, whether you have hormonal fluctuations, water retention, bloating, maybe you haven't gone to the bathroom that day. Whatever it is, maybe you stepped on a different scale that wasn't your own scale, or maybe the scale moved from one room to the next. That number is always changing due to so many variables. And so it's not supposed to be the same number every day, but because when we are very dependent on this number and we see that number change, our emotions change with it. And I absolutely hated this part of having an eating disorder. Don't let your inner peace be so cheap, right? Don't give away your inner peace so easily. Don't let the scale rob you of your inner peace. Protect yourself from emotional triggers by not stepping on the scale to begin with. I really want to remind you here that in recovery, it is important that you stay emotionally well and that you minimize triggers around you. And I do think that stepping on the scale can be an extreme emotional trigger. So that is number one. The number two reason why you should stop weighing yourself is that the scale makes you obsess over numbers. And I find when you focus on the number on the scale, you start to obsess over that number. It becomes a point of reference that determines how you feel day to day. And by definition, your weight is literally your gravitational pull. So what I mean by that is the earth pulls on all objects with a force of gravity downwards towards the center of the earth. That is literally all your weight is. It is the earth's gravitational pull on your body. It is that literal and that neutral. However, when we focus and obsess over that number, that neutrality disappears and it starts to feel so much more than a number. And in fact, focusing on this number makes it even more tempting to focus on all numbers. So I find if you're focusing on the number on the scale, you're also tracking, you're also counting, you're also looking at nutrition labels, and it just gets to be so overwhelming and so trapping. Like it makes you lose your internal freedom in a way because your brain is so focused on calculating, budgeting. Am I allowed to eat this? Am I not allowed to eat that? It will literally make your head spin. And remember, like I said before, the number on the scale is fleeting. It is so unreliable. All scales are different and your body varies so much from day to day. So you're putting all of this emotional importance and physical importance on a number that is always changing due to small things. And if the number on the scale is something your recovery team requires, I want to remind you that there are many options for you to step on the scale without seeing that number. It is possible to get blind weigh-ins if the number on the scale is important for your recovery team to know at this time. But bottom line is, if that is not your case, I want you to question, why are you so focused on this number? And also ask yourself, why am I focusing on something so small? What could I be focusing on instead of constantly calculating and ruminating over numbers? So honestly ask yourself, if I wasn't focusing on this number, what could I be focusing on instead? Okay, so that was number 2. Number 3, I want you to stop stepping on the scale because the scale disconnects you from your body signals. I see this in my practice all the time. When someone is really dependent on their scale, it becomes their permission giver. So instead of listening to their body, they're turning externally to that number to give them permission to eat or move, etc. So it will tell them how much or how little they can eat that day, or how much or how little they need to exercise. And so instead of trusting the signals that our body is giving us, using the scale makes us very dependent on that number, to the point where we're literally ignoring our body signals to change and manipulate that number, which is so not okay and so not a recovery-oriented place to be. I find that when my clients see a number on the scale they don't want to see, sometimes it gives them more reason to restrict. Even if they're super hungry or haven't had a meal in a while, they're going to ignore that hunger signal so that they can have that number on the scale change. And this is just not healthy at all. Recovery is all about staying in tune with your body. And in order to do this, you need to start trusting your body and putting your body's cues and signals before the number on the scale. So I want to just make this be the main point here. When you step on the scale, you lose your power because you're no longer turning to your body to check in to see what you need, right? So you are no longer turning to yourself as the authority. You are turning to the scale as your ultimate authority to tell you how to feel, what to eat, what to think, the mood. But in this case, honestly, how much to eat, right? When I say it becomes your permission giver, you're giving the scale all of that power, which is really supposed to be your power. The ideal situation is that you are connected to your body and you're honoring the signals it gives you and all of the cues that it gives you. Your body isn't lying to you. Your body isn't going to try to manipulate you. It doesn't have a hidden agenda. Like, your body is going to communicate clearly to you what it wants. I also want to remind you here that when you've had an eating disorder for a while and you've stopped listening to the cues that it gives you, your body will actually stop sending you hunger cues, which is why you might be extremely undernourished and not getting those hunger signals anymore. And so I want to remind you that there might be a period of time where you need to work with your team to start re-nourishing your body to get those signals back. And that requires consistent nourishment over time. And soon enough, those body signals will return. And it's up to you when they do return to essentially honor those signals, start responding to them so that your body will trust you again. And I really do feel like the scale puts you in jeopardy of losing that connection. The scale will always disconnect you from your body. It will make you focus so much on the outside and that number and lose sight of what is really the most important signal, which is what your body is telling you and the cues that it's giving you. The scale is something external. It can feel very easy to turn to something external to know how to think, feel, and act. But deep down, recovery always comes back to checking in with yourself, checking in with your body, and honoring what you and your body needs. All right. The fourth reason why I want you to ditch your scale immediately is that it ties your self-worth to your weight, which is total crap. I find when you focus on the number on the scale, you start to obsess over that number. You start to assign so much meaning to that number, and you base so much of your worth on what that number is. If the number is low, you're feeling worthy. If the number goes up, you're not worthy. Without the number on the scale, you can actually focus on things that bring actual fulfillment and worth into your life. Imagine if you didn't care about the number on the scale. Think about how your life would be different and how you would perceive yourself. Think about how your self-esteem would change if you didn't care or know about that number on the scale. Could you imagine how much brain space and emotional energy you could reclaim if you weren't constantly beating yourself up over that number? When you let go of that number on the scale and stop connecting it to your worth, you can focus on who you are as a person, not as a body. Without having the scale determine your worth, you're actually forced to go deeper than that and to explore your worth in a more meaningful way and find out your worthiness from the inside. And the beautiful thing about worth is that you are born worthy of everything. You are born worthy of love, worthy of joy, worthy of purpose, worthy of friendship and meaningful relationships. And if you are really hung up on something external, like this scale, you start to think that worth isn't yours anymore because that number is determining so much of your value, which is completely incorrect. So remember that you are so much more than the number on the scale. And you mean more. Your life is so much more meaningful than that number or the way your body looks. And when you're constantly on the scale, it's really easy to forget that. Okay, the fifth and final reason why I want you to ditch the scale is because it can actually strengthen your eating disorder and it can trigger the use of eating disorder behaviors. I mean, the scale is almost a direct path to using a behavior. Like if we were supposed to create a flow chart of what causes purging or what causes restriction or even what causes binging, stepping on that scale is a massive trigger for so many. The scale increases the loudness and the volume and the severity of your eating disorder voice. Usually, the eating disorder gets louder no matter which direction the number on the scales go. Think about it. If that number goes up, the eating disorder is going to berate you and tell you to restrict. If the number goes down, the eating disorder is still going to berate you and it will still tell you to restrict or use a behavior to keep losing weight. There's usually never a number that satisfies the eating disorder. So stepping on the scale is essentially a lose-lose for your recovery to begin with. I know that when people see the number go down, their eating disorder is triggered because it wants to keep doing the eating disorder things that made the number go down. It is setting yourself up to just stay stuck in this perpetual eating disorder cycle. And there is essentially never a number on the scale that your eating disorder will be satisfied. And even more scary, it can cause you to stay trapped in eating disorder behaviors for way too long. And I think if there's one thing that's super frustrating is being stuck in that cycle of being triggered and then using a behavior and then recovering from that and then being triggered and using a behavior. If you stop stepping on the scale, you will decrease your triggers and you will decrease your chances of using a behavior. It is actually that simple. And for the record, I have probably coached several hundred people one-on-one and in groups at this point, and I don't know a single individual who could say they were fully recovered who continued to weigh themselves. Every client I've ever had who has reached full recovery has stopped weighing themselves completely. They are fully aware of how harmful the behavior is and how sabotaging the behavior is and how it can keep them stuck and trigger them to fall back into old harmful patterns. So I want you to let that sink in because it's really important for you to hear and realize that full recovery usually requires letting go of the scale. Again, all of my fully recovered clients have completely let go of the scale. You really cannot keep hanging on to that number and reach a place of healing with food and healing with your body and finding some level of body acceptance or body tolerance. It's honestly extremely conflicting with recovery in and of itself. I know that some of you need the scale in order to heal and restore your weight, and I acknowledge that. And I also want to remind you that you have a team that can find ways around you not knowing that number, such as finding a numberless scale and such as the clear step scale or just doing blind weights. And also when you're at your doctor's appointments, making sure that you ask them to not tell you the number. There are definitely ways you can protect yourself from this. And I know it's really scary and it might cause you to feel anxiety to think about letting go of this, but I know that you can do it. And I know that it will feel really hard at first, but overall, it will be worth it and it will protect the progress you're making in recovery. It will protect your inner peace. And eventually it will really help you tap into intuitive eating because you'll be turning back to yourself to feel what you need to eat and how much and what sounds good. So you're turning to your body to be the authority instead of the scale. It's really empowering to let go of this once and for all. So if you're truly struggling with this, I want you to ask yourself the question, who would I be without this scale? How would I think, feel, and behave differently? Or if the number on the scale didn't matter, how would I think, feel, and behave differently? If thinking about getting rid of the scale increases your anxiety, it is simply a sign that you are a little too dependent on this number and on what it tells you to do or not do. And I encourage you to work with your team to set goals around letting this number go. When I work with my clients one-on-one, we decide together which method works best, whether that's giving it up cold turkey or setting goals to slowly give up the scale over time. Both work. So over the holidays, I encourage you to work with your team to set a goal around this and potentially not even seeing the number over the holidays. Maybe it's going to look like stepping on the scale significantly less, or maybe it's giving your scale to someone on your team or a friend that you trust so you don't have to access the scale anymore. And it could even look like going to the backyard and taking a sledgehammer to that scale because you have some anger to take out on it as well. And that can be very cathartic. Either way, I highly recommend for you to stop using the scale, ditch the scale right away for the 5 reasons I've already listed. And I'll recap those right now. First, the scale is an emotional roller coaster. Secondly, it causes you to obsess over numbers. Third, it disconnects you from your body signals and destroys your intuition because of that. 4, it ties your self-worth to your weight, which is honestly a terrible thing to base your self-worth on. And then finally, It strengthens your eating disorder voice and triggers behaviors that can keep you stuck. All right, my friends, that is all I have for you today. I hope you really enjoyed this episode of the Full and Thriving podcast. As always, it is a true honor to have you here listening and learning and healing with me. And I also wanted to say that I am so appreciative of anyone who shares this episode with a friend or someone in need, because this is why I show up every week for you, is to really reach those people who don't have access to healing, who don't have access to treatment, who need something to inspire them to take the next step in getting better in whatever form that looks like. So with that, I just want to say I have the deepest gratitude for everybody listening. I am thinking of all of you during the holidays. I know that it's an extremely difficult time. And if you are in need of help, I wanted to remind you that I do have a one-on-one coaching practice. We're always accepting new clients. And I wanted to remind you that the doors to the Recovery Collective will be opening again at the end of January. So please head on over to the website so that you can join my recovery community. We are just so thrilled every time we have new members join. And I am so personally very excited to meet full and thriving listeners whenever they do come into the community. So keep that in mind if you're looking for more support as we head on into 2024. I hope you all have happy holidays. I will see you again very soon. All right, that concludes this week's episode of the Full and Thriving podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode of the show. When you have a moment, please head on over to Instagram and follow my recovery coaching account at Meg_McCabe to stay up to date on everything I'm doing in recovery land. And if you're feeling extra inspired, please send me a direct message to let me know how this podcast has impacted your life. I'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.